Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a huge question, really. Something as old as humanity itself, where religion comes from, how it evolved.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
And this whole exploration was actually sparked by you, our listener, asking about that seemingly universal impulse to worship. Why do humans do it?
It's a great question.
So we've pulled together this comprehensive overview. It's called History of Religion. And it draws on, well, all sorts of perspectives, cultural, psychological, even scientific.
Trying to get a rounded picture.
Exactly. And our mission here for this deep dive is basically to pull out the most insightful bits about the roots of belief and, its enduring impact.
Right. Giving you a clearer understanding without drowning you in, like, academic jargon.
Hopefully. So, okay, where do we even start? Where are those first flickers of belief?
Well, if you think about early human societies, I mean, they were just surrounded by the unknown, weren't they? Birth, death, the weather, the stars.
Things they couldn't explain easily.
Exactly. So, culturally speaking, religion probably started as a way to make sense of all that. Animism, for instance.
Animism. Remind me.
It's the idea that spirits inhabit the natural world. A tree isn't just a tree. It's got some kind of inner life and essence.
Okay, right. Like everything has this sort of hidden layer to it.
Pretty much. And that seems to be one of the earliest frameworks for how they related to, well, everything around them.
So what did that give them, practically speaking? Just an explanation.
Well, it's more than just explanation. Early humans also had to deal with, sticking together as groups and just the sheer anxiety of being alive.
Sure. Life was precarious.
Totally. And rituals. Wow, some evidence goes back hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah.
They seem crucial here.
Rituals, like how?
Well, these shared activities, they strengthen the bonds in the community, right?
Mm-hmm.
They probably provided some moral guidance, too, a sense of what's okay and what's not.
A shared rule book.
Kind of. And maybe, just maybe, it gave them a feeling of having some control or at least influence in a world that felt really unpredictable.
Yeah, I can see that. It's actually kind of sobering when you mention those burial rites from, over 100,000 years ago?
It is.
I mean, that feels like incredibly strong evidence for early ideas about something beyond death and afterlife.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
really suggests they were grappling with mortality very, very early on, which, if we shift gears a bit to psychology,
Okay.
brings us to this idea of agency detection. It's fascinating.
Agency detection.
Yeah, think about it like this. You're driving at night, see a weird shape by the road, maybe a bent sign or a bush, and for a split second you think it's a person or an animal.
Oh, yeah. It happens all the time, that little jump.
Right. That's your agency detection.
Yeah.
Your brain's basically wired to over-detect potential agents, potential threats, because missing a real threat is way worse than seeing one that isn't there.
A built-in safety mechanism.
Exactly. Yeah. So the theory goes, early humans applied that same tendency to the natural world. An unexpected storm, a rustle in the bushes.
Yeah.
Maybe it wasn't just random. Maybe something caused it. An unseen force, a spirit.
So that survival instinct kind of dialed way up, started populating the world with invisible beings.
That's one prominent idea, yeah. And our source material brings up another psychological angle, too.
Which is?
Terror management theory.
Okay, sounds serious.
Well, it deals with a serious thing, the fact that we know we're going to die. That awareness, it creates this underlying anxiety.
Existential dread, basically.
You got it. And terror management theory suggests that religious belief systems offer a powerful buffer against that dread.
How so?
By providing things like symbolic immortality, think afterlife, reincarnation, leaving a legacy and a sense of meaning, a purpose within a larger cosmic plan. It helps us manage the terror of knowing we're finite.
So faith gives us a story where we continue, in a way.
Yeah.
Even when faced with death.
Precisely. It helps us feel like life isn't just, poof and you're gone. And that ties right into another core human need our overview mentions: narrative.
We love stories.
We're wired for them. Religion provided, and still provides, these incredibly compelling narratives about where we came from, why we're here, what our place is in the grand scheme of things.
Tackling the big questions with a story. Makes sense. Okay, now, the overview also dips into the science side, neurology.
Yeah, this is pretty interesting. It seems that religious experiences, things like deep prayer, meditation, those aha moments of insight, they actually activate specific parts of the brain.
Really? Which parts?
Areas involved in things like attention, self-awareness, emotion, the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system. It suggests these practices engage both our thinking and our feeling parts.
So our brains are kind of responsive to this stuff.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
And then there's the evolutionary perspective. Did being religious actually help groups survive?
Good question. Did it?
The evidence suggests it might have. Think about it. Shared beliefs, shared rituals that could create much stronger group cohesion.
Makes groups work together better.
Yeah, better cooperation for hunting, defense, sharing food. Plus, if you have shared moral codes, that builds trust within the group. People know what to expect from each other.
Okay, so stronger, more cooperative groups might have outcompeted less cohesive ones.
That's the idea. But you raised a good point earlier. Implicitly, could that strong in-group feeling also lead to conflict between groups?
Yeah, the US versus them potential. Definitely a double-edged sword there.
It could well be. So, okay, we've talked about these potential origins, psychological, social, maybe evolutionary. Where do we see the first, concrete signs of organized religion? Buildings and stuff.
Right.
Our overview points to Göbekli Tepe. It's in modern-day Turkey.
Heard of it. It's incredibly old, right?
Unbelievably old. We're talking around 9600 BCE. And what's really mind-blowing is that this complex, potentially the world's first temple complex, seems to predate widespread agriculture.
Wait, so temple building before farming settlements?
That's what the evidence suggests. It kind of flips the script. Maybe these big ritual activities were actually a driving force behind people settling down, organizing labor, developing agriculture later.
Wow. Okay. That is a challenge to the old timeline. Ritual first. Fascinating. What about later on? Say, Mesopotamia, Sumer.
Right. Jump forward a few thousand years, maybe 3500 BCE or so. Sumerian religion gets quite complex. Polytheistic, lots of gods and goddesses, each with their own domains.
A whole pantheon.
Exactly. And what's really significant is that a lot of their myths, their stories, their character archetypes, they seem to pop up later in other cultures across the ancient Near East.
So these stories were traveling, influencing others.
Definitely seems like it. They weren't just isolated tales, they were part of a larger cultural exchange.
Setting the stage, you could say. And then, of course, Egypt. Hard to ignore ancient Egypt.
Impossible. Their religion, as the overview notes, gave us some really enduring concepts, like the idea of a divine judgment after death.
The weighing of the heart ceremony.
That kind of thing, yeah. And a very complex, detailed vision of the afterlife. You see it in their pyramids, their mummification, all that elaborate preparation.
They were seriously invested in what came next. Now, how did these big, structured religions like Sumer's or Egypt's compare with, say, tribal beliefs, indigenous cultures?
That's a good contrast. Tribal or indigenous traditions often rely much more heavily on oral traditions stories passed down by word of mouth, not written scriptures.
More fluid, maybe?
Perhaps. And nature is usually central, along with ancestor veneration honoring those who came before. You often find totemism, too.
Connection to specific animals or plants.
Right, a spiritual link. And these beliefs tend to be very localized, deeply woven into daily life, often without the kind of centralized rule books or hierarchies you see in later, larger religions. And the overview also mentions shamanism specifically.
Ah, yes, the shaman figure, always intriguing.
Very. Shamans are seen as intermediaries, right? Bridging the gap between the everyday world and the spirit world.
How do they do that?
Often through altered states of consciousness, trance, drumming, sometimes plant medicines to communicate with spirits, get wisdom, maybe perform healing. It's about navigating different layers of reality.
The very different approach. Now, we talked about understanding the world, social needs. But what about just sheer dramatic events? Floods, volcanoes, eclipses. Surely they played a role.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine experiencing a massive volcanic eruption or a huge flood without any scientific explanation.
Terrifying. Must have felt like the world was ending.
Exactly. These powerful, often scary events were frequently interpreted as divine signals, warnings, punishments, displays of godly power.
Messages from the beyond.
Pretty much. And as human societies got more complex and people started asking deeper questions, where did we come from? What's our purpose? Myths provided the answers, the frameworks for understanding these big life questions.
So the stories helped make sense of a world that must have often felt completely chaotic.
Yeah, essential sense-making tools. Now, something our overview really stresses, and it's crucial, is that religions didn't just pop up in isolation.
Right, they influenced each other.
Massively. There's been constant interaction, borrowing, adapting. The overview gives some great examples.
Like what?
Well, think about flood myths. The Babylonian story in the Epic of Gilgamesh has clear echoes in the Hebrew story of Noah's Ark.
Okay, yeah.
Or Zoroastrianism, an ancient Persian religion, had this strong concept of dualism, a cosmic battle between good and evil, light and darkness. Some scholars think that influenced the development of the idea of Satan in Judaism and later Christianity.
Interesting. So ideas were traveling and getting woven into new belief systems.
Exactly. Or take the Greek philosophical idea of the logos reason, the divine word.
Right.
You see that concept picked up and transformed in the opening of the Gospel of John in the New Testament.
Yeah.
In the beginning was the word logos.
Wow. Direct link there.
Seems like it. And you see Buddhist meditation techniques potentially influencing Christian mystics or even older pagan holidays.
Like winter solstice celebrations.
Yeah, things like that getting absorbed and reframed into Christian traditions like Christmas and Easter.
So the religious map we see today is really a product of centuries of this mixing and matching.
In many ways, yes. And the overview makes a really important point here. This borrowing, this evolution, it doesn't automatically make a religion less true or invalid.
It just shows how culture shapes belief.
Exactly. It reflects how beliefs adapt and change within their specific historical and cultural context. It highlights this ongoing human quest for meaning.
That's a much more nuanced way to see it. Not just copying, but adapting. Okay, speaking of the big players, our source gives a quick rundown of some major world religions.
Yeah, it touches on Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, giving rough start dates, key figures, major influences.
And what's the takeaway there?
Well, a key theme is how each of them, in their own way, drew upon and integrated elements from belief systems that came before them.
In what ways?
Everything from language and customs to specific holidays to ideas about how the cosmos works. You asked for an example.
Yeah, maybe one specific link.
Okay, we'll take Judaism's emphasis on monotheism, one all-powerful God. That was a pretty radical idea in the ancient world, and it profoundly shaped early Christianity, which started as essentially a Jewish sect before branching off.
Right, so the roots are clear.
Absolutely. So when we spot similarities across different faiths, it's often less about direct copying and more about this process of adaptation, transformation, religious evolution, really.
Evolution, okay. Now, despite all these unique paths, the overview also points out something striking. These recurring themes that pop up across totally different cultures.
It's pretty amazing when you look at it, like creation myths, stories about how everything began.
Every culture seems to have one.
Almost. You've got Genesis in the Bible, the Rig Veda in Hinduism, the Enuma Elish from Babylon. Different stories, but tackling the same fundamental question.
And flood myths too, right?
Yep, Gilgamesh, Noah, the Hindu story of Manu. This idea of a world-destroying flood and a chosen survivor seems almost universal.
Why do you think that is?
Well, that's the big question the overview raises. And moral duality, light versus dark, good versus evil, that's another common thread. Even really specific motifs like virgin births, gods dying and resurrecting, divine trials. They appear in traditions that seemingly had no contact.
So what's going on there? Does the overview offer theories?
It presents a few possibilities to think about. Could it point to some kind of shared fundamental truth? Maybe something like Carl Jung's archetypes, universal patterns of the human psyche? Or even a hint of a common divine revelation?
Or maybe something more?
Human, exactly. Could it just be our shared psychology? Our brains are pattern-seeking machines. We love narrative. Maybe we naturally generate similar kinds of stories to explain things.
Or shared experiences, like maybe floods were common traumatic events.
That's another strong possibility. Shared environmental challenges, shared social needs. Maybe those just naturally lead different cultures to develop similar myths and beliefs to cope.
Nature, nurture, or maybe something transcendental. Lots to chew on there. Which brings us squarely to the tricky issue of truth in religion. How do we even approach evaluating religious claims?
Yeah, this is where it gets really complex. The overview suggests making a distinction. On one hand, you have historical claims.
Like whether Jesus or Buddha actually existed as historical figures.
Right, or whether certain events described actually happened. These are things historians can investigate using evidence, archaeology, textual analysis, the usual historical toolkit.
Okay, but then there are the other claims.
Then you have supernatural claims, miracles, divine interventions, talking snakes, things that, by definition, operate outside the normal laws of nature.
Things science can't really test.
Exactly. Science works by looking for natural explanations and repeatable experiments. It can't really prove or disprove the supernatural. That falls more into the realm of faith or philosophy.
Right. And the overview also flags the importance of how these stories were originally understood, right? Oral tradition, allegory.
Yes, that's crucial. Many scholars argue that a lot of ancient religious texts, especially the narrative parts, weren't necessarily intended by their original authors or audiences to be taken as literal, factual history.
More like teaching stories.
Often, yes. Allegories, myths using symbolic language to teach moral lessons, to explore deep philosophical questions, or to describe metaphysical realities.
Well, maybe we impose our modern idea of literal history onto texts that were doing something different.
That's a real possibility.
Yeah.
In modern scholarship, things like biblical criticism, comparing myths across cultures, archaeology can definitely shed light on this. It might reveal historical inconsistencies or show how stories evolved or highlight symbolic meanings.
Does that invalidate the text, though?
Not necessarily. For many people, discovering the symbolic depth or the historical context actually enriches their understanding. The overview uses Adam and Eve as an example. Even if you don't take the story of the garden and the snake literally, it still speaks powerfully about human nature, temptation, innocence, the origins of suffering, deep, meaningful insights, even if it's perhaps mythological rather than historical.
So the truth isn't just about factual accuracy.
It might not be. The question becomes, what kind of truth are we looking for in religion? Factual, philosophical, symbolic, moral? Maybe it's a mix. And different stories emphasize different aspects.
That definitely changes how you read things. Instead of just asking, did this happen, you ask, what does this mean?
Exactly. And when you look at those big supernatural claims, Noah's flood covering the entire globe, Jesus walking on water, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Our overview presents various ways people interpret them. Some suggest maybe they started as accounts of smaller, localized events, a big regional flood. Perhaps that got magnified over time in the telling.
Or misunderstood natural phenomena.
That's another interpretation. Or maybe they were always intended as purely symbolic stories, illustrating God's power or faithfulness, not as literal event reporting.
And then there's the faith interpretation.
And of course, for countless believers, these are literal miracles, acts of divine power, accepted on faith. Which brings up fascinating questions about subjective experience and the nature of belief itself.
It really seems to circle back to interpretation and what kind of truth one is seeking. Okay, let's dive back into the science side for a moment. We mentioned agency detection, that hyperactive agency detection device, or HADD.
Right, HADD, that evolutionary idea that our brains are basically biased towards assuming there's an agent and a mind, an intention behind ambiguous events.
Better safe than sorry. Assume the rustle is a tiger, not just the wind.
Precisely. And that tendency, applied over millennia, could easily have contributed to beliefs in invisible agents, spirits, ancestors, gods, lurking behind natural phenomena or unexplained occurrences.
Makes evolutionary sense. And what about theory of mind?
Ah, yes. That's our ability to understand that other beings have minds, thoughts, intentions, beliefs that are different from our own.
Crucial for social interaction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it also makes it possible for us to imagine gods who have minds, who have intentions, who we can interact with, please, or anger. We naturally tend to think of deities in human-like terms, attributing intentions to them.
We anthropomorphize them.
In a way, yes. And speaking of the biological basis, our overview also mentions the chemistry of rituals. Oxytocin.
The cuddle hormone, bonding.
That's the one. Studies suggest that engaging in religious rituals, especially communal ones involving chanting, singing, shared movement, it can actually increase oxytocin levels in participants' brains.
And that would make people feel closer.
Exactly. It reinforces feelings of trust, group loyalty, social connection. It provides a potential biological underpinning for why religious practice often fosters such strong community bonds. Our biology might actually be nudging us towards belief and belonging.
Wow. Culture, psychology, biology, all weaving together. It's complex.
It really is. And of course, religion hasn't just been about personal belief or community. It's been deeply tangled up with power throughout history.
Oh, definitely. You can't separate them easily.
The overview makes that clear. Think about the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs got their authority directly from God. Huge justification for power.
Made questioning the king like questioning God.
Pretty much. Or look at how often religion was used to legitimize conquest and conversion. The spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire, the expansion of Islamic caliphates, the role of missions during colonialism.
Religion as a tool for empire building.
It often served that function, providing both justification and a means of social control and integration. Empires also frequently did this clever thing of absorbing local gods into their own pantheon.
Like the Romans did, adding local deities to their roster.
Exactly. It was a way to kind of co-opt existing beliefs and make conquered people feel included to smooth the transition.
Smart, in a way. It makes you wonder, though, over the long haul, what kept belief systems going? Was it genuine faith, or were these practical benefits, social order, political power, just more important?
That's a really tough question. The overview suggests it's likely a complex mix of both. Sincere belief and functional advantages reinforcing each other.
Hard to untangle those threads. Now let's talk about the actual texts, the scriptures. Our overview brings up language issues.
Yeah, translation is a huge factor. Many core religious texts were originally in ancient languages: Hebrew, Greek, Sanskrit, Arabic.
Languages most people today don't read.
Right. And translating isn't just swapping words. Nuances get lost. Meanings can shift subtly over time and across cultures. The classic example often cited is in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Isaiah.
What's the example?
There's a word alma used to describe a young woman. In the later Greek translation used by early Christians, it was rendered as parthenos, which specifically means virgin.
Ah, big difference theologically speaking.
Huge, especially for the later Christian doctrine of the virgin birth. So a single translation choice can have massive downstream effects. And we also have to remember, many of these stories started out just being told.
Oral traditions passed down generation to generation.
Exactly. For a long time, maybe centuries, these narratives lived and breathed through storytellers before anyone wrote them down systematically.
And stories change in the telling, right?
Naturally. Details might shift, emphasis might change depending on the audience or the teller. Then comes the process of actually deciding which writings make it into the official canon, the accepted scripture.
And that wasn't always purely a spiritual decision, was it?
According to our overview, no. Politics often played a big role. Think about the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century CE.
Constantine, Roman emperor.
Right. Decisions were made there about core Christian doctrines, and certain texts, like many of the Gnostic Gospels, which presented different views of Jesus, were deliberately excluded. Power dynamics shaped the Bible as we know it.
So the canon itself is a product of history and, well, politics.
To a significant degree, yes. Which raises the big question: how should we approach Scripture? As literal history, as infallible moral guidance? Or as something more complex, a collection of historically situated texts, inspired perhaps, but requiring careful interpretation?
It demands a lot of context, it seems. Now, religion isn't static, obviously. It changes. The overview mentions big shifts.
Definitely. One major period highlighted is the Axial Age, roughly 800 to 200 BCE.
What happened then?
It's this incredible period where, across different parts of the world, you see the emergence of really transformative philosophical and religious ideas. Thinkers like Socrates in Greece, the Buddha in India, Confucius in China, the Hebrew prophets, all challenging old ways and focusing more on ethics, introspection, universal principles.
Oh, like a global wave of new thinking.
It kind of looks like it. Whether it's interconnected or just coincidental, scholars debate, but it was hugely influential.
And much later, another big shakeup.
The Protestant Reformation in 16th century Europe, massive shift, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church, emphasizing individual interpretation of the Bible. It really reshaped Western Christianity and society.
Led to more decentralization of belief.
Absolutely. And even today, we see constant change. New religious movements spring up. Traditional faiths adapt to modern science, secularism, changing social values. It's always evolving.
It's a living thing, not a museum piece. Which leads to today's world. Globalization, the internet, that's got to have a huge impact.
Oh, enormous. Our overview points out that now you can instantly access information about virtually any religion on the planet.
Compare beliefs, practices.
Yeah, it fosters more comparison, maybe more interfaith dialogue, but also potentially more confusion or conflict. We're also seeing a rise in religious mixing, what scholars call syncretism.
People blending different traditions.
Exactly, taking bits and pieces, maybe meditation from Buddhism, ethical ideas from Christianity, connection to nature from indigenous spirituality, and then there's the whole spiritual but not religious phenomena.
SBNR, hear that a lot.
Right. People seeking meaning, transcendence, connection, but doing it outside the framework of traditional organized religion. They might embrace mindfulness, yoga, astrology, ancestral practices.
A more personalized spiritual path. What does all this mean for the old institutions?
That's the big question. It certainly challenges their authority, their traditional ways of doing things. Belief becomes much more individualized, less tied to dogma.
Interesting time. Okay, let's loop back to that perennial topic, science versus religion. The overview suggests it's not always a simple fight.
No, the conflict thesis is probably too simplistic. Sure, clashes happen, especially when religious texts are interpreted literally in ways that contradict scientific findings, like young Earth creationism versus geology and biology.
The six-day creation story, for example.
Right. But many religious people find ways to reconcile their faith with science. Theistic evolution is a good example.
The idea that God used evolution as the mechanism for creation.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Seeing science and faith is describing different aspects of reality or operating at different levels. And it's worth remembering, some major scientific figures like Einstein weren't traditionally religious, but expressed a deep sense of awe and mystery about the cosmos, a kind of spirituality found through science.
So maybe they're both quests for truth, just using different tools.
That's one way to look at it. Wonder, meaning understanding our place.
Mm-hmm.
Those drives can fuel both scientific inquiry and religious exploration. Now, we've focused a lot on the history, the sociology, the ideas, but the overview also brings us back to the inner experience.
Right, the personal side of faith, what it feels like.
Exactly. Mystical experiences. Those moments people report across all traditions, feeling connected to everything, a sense of timelessness, overwhelming peace, or ecstasy.
Experiences that often change people's lives.
Profoundly. And interestingly, there's research mentioned in our sources on psychedelics. Both historical use in indigenous cultures and modern clinical studies show that substances like psilocybin can reliably trigger experiences that people describe as deeply mystical or religious.
Wow. Plant medicine tapping into something deep.
It seems so. And separate from that, studies looking at the brains of long-term meditators or people engaged in intense prayer show actual measurable neurological changes, different patterns of brain activity.
So something is definitely happening physiologically.
Clearly. But then the question becomes, what do these experiences mean? Are they proof of a divine reality? Are they just complex brain chemistry? Or is that even the right question?
Maybe the impact is what matters most.
Perhaps. Does the personal transformation, the sense of meaning derived, hold more weight than whether we can objectively prove its source? It's a deep philosophical point.
Yeah, no easy answers there. Okay, another modern trend the overview mentions is, well, religious decline in some places.
Right, particularly in parts of Europe and North America. The secularization hypothesis predicted this. As societies get more modern, educated, scientific, religion was expected to fade away.
But it hasn't universally, right?
Not at all. The overview is clear that this trend is far from global. In many parts of Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, religion is actually growing, sometimes rapidly. Secularization isn't a one-size-fits-all story.
So it's patchy.
Very. And even where formal church attendance or religious identification declines, the overview notes that the underlying ideas, the values, the stories from religious traditions often hang around in the culture. In ethics, law, art, everyday assumptions.
The ghost in the machine, kind of?
You could say that. The cultural DNA persists. And it also raises the question, if people move away from traditional religion, what fills that gap?
The need for meaning, belonging, doesn't just disappear.
Exactly. Our overview talks about potential psychological substitutes. People might pour that energy into intense political ideologies or passionate sports fandoms, or even things like wellness culture or online communities, things that offer identity, community, purpose, maybe even rituals.
Finding meaning elsewhere.
Seems like it. Suggests that maybe the object of belief changes, but that fundamental human need to believe in something bigger than ourselves, to connect, to find meaning, that might be a constant.
We just keep searching. Which brings us right back to truth, doesn't it? What kind of truth are we even talking about with religion?
The overview really pushes us to think about this philosophically. It makes that distinction again. Empirical truth versus existential truth.
Okay, explain that difference again.
Empirical truth is about facts, evidence, things you can test or observe. Did a global flood happen exactly as described in Genesis? That's an empirical question, and the scientific evidence says no.
Okay.
Existential truth is about meaning, value, purpose, how to live. Can the story of Noah's Ark, even if not literally true, convey profound truths about judgment, redemption, hope, humanity's relationship with the divine or nature? For millions, the answer is yes. That's existential truth.
So a story can be existentially true, even if not empirically factual.
That's the idea. It resonates with our human condition. And this ties into the idea of faith versus justified belief.
Belief based on evidence versus belief without it.
Kind of. Is belief only valid if it's backed by empirical proof? Or can faith belief held in the absence, or even despite the lack, of empirical evidence still be meaningful, valuable, even rational in its own way?
Yeah.
The overview suggests thinking of religions less like literal descriptions of reality.
Like a science textbook.
Right, and more like symbolic maps. Maps of meaning, maps for navigating life's journey, maps of the human psyche. A map isn't the territory itself, but it can still be incredibly useful for finding your way.
So the key shift is from asking, is this map literally accurate in every detail?
They're asking, what wisdom does this map offer? What deeper reality is it trying to point towards?
That's a really helpful metaphor. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big picture, the main takeaway from exploring religion's origins and evolution?
I think ultimately religion, in all its incredible diversity, its changes, its persistence, it really looks like a mirror reflecting our deepest human selves.
How so?
It reflects our fears of death, of chaos, of meaninglessness. It reflects our hopes for connection, for purpose, for transcendence. It reflects that relentless human drive to understand our place in this huge, mysterious universe and to connect with something larger than ourselves.
So whether you see it as ultimately coming from God or gods or from human psychology and culture,
Or some complex interplay of all of the above.
it's undeniably been one of the most powerful forces shaping who we are, how we live together, how civilizations have developed.
Absolutely. And the kinds of truths it offers, as we've discussed, often seem to operate on that existential level, speaking to our shared condition, our search for meaning, perhaps more than on a purely factual one.
Which leads to a final thought, something for you, our listener, to maybe chew on. We've talked about the evolution, the borrowing, the seeming contradictions within and between religions.
Yeah, the messy human side of it all.
Exactly. But maybe those imperfections, those inconsistencies, those historical layers, maybe they aren't just flaws to be explained away. Maybe they're actually opening.
Open it.
Yeah, like cracks or windows, places where the light of deeper insight, of human complexity, of enduring questions can actually shine through. Perhaps a reminder that even something that seems imperfect or has holes can still hold and transmit something profound.
That's a beautiful way to put it. So we definitely encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, see what resonates with your own journey, your own search for understanding and meaning.